This is Jim Comstock-Galligan again. I've previously done a module involving inclusion as well as functional behavioral assessments and behavior intervention plans. That module finished, and with probably I finished the inclusion portion of the presentation, and I finished about 2/3 of the presentation on functional behavioral assessments and behavior intervention plans. So I hope you're sticking around for the end of the functional behavioral assessment and behavior intervention plan presentation. Once I conclude this, we are then going to cover related services and finish with extended school year services. So let's begin continuing with the functional behavioral assessment and behavior intervention plan presentation. So one of the things that we just covered in the previous module, if you've listened to that, is that in doing a functional behavioral assessment, there are 6 major components. One is an indirect assessment involving interviews. 2 is direct observations of the student. 3 is reviewing all records related to the student. 4 is doing an analysis of the interviews, the direct observations, and the student's records in order to come up with 5, the hypothesis statement as to what is the function of a student's behavior. And then number 6, it is important to test your hypothesis about the function of a student's behavior. So we covered that in the earlier module. Now we're going to talk about, in light of those key FBA elements, what are some of the common issues that you will encounter if your son or daughter or any relative of yours ever has a functional behavioral assessment during their educational career? Here are some of the issues. Indirect assessment. Throughout my career in working with kids with behavioral challenges and looking at functional behavioral assessments that were conducted, oftentimes I look at them after the fact, because parents come to me and they have issues with the fact that their kids are having ongoing behavioral challenges and the kid's functional behavioral assessment, if the kid has one, isn't any good. And also, the behavior intervention plan, which may flow from a functional behavioral assessment, then isn't any good either. So here are some of the things you should look for if you have concerns about whether a functional behavioral assessment is a quality functional behavioral assessment, and I will refer to it from this point forward as an FBA. Indirect assessment. One of the common issues that I see is there's no interviews with the student. An FBA is not going to be really that great if there's not an interview with the student and the student's parents. Or there may not be interviews with school personnel who have observed the problem behavior. If a student's problem behavior occurs on the playground, and there's no interviews with the playground monitors, it's not likely we're going to have a functional behavioral assessment that's going to really get at what the function of the kid's behavior is. You know, student always needs to be interviewed. The student's parents always need to be interviewed. And the most germane educators always need to be interviewed. And if a kid's behavior issues are on the playground, then the most germane educators are the playground monitors. So I oftentimes see there's been no interview with the people who've actually observed the kid's behavior. Direct assessment. There's no student observation in the functional behavioral assessment. That functional behavioral assessment, if it does not include an observation of the student, it's not worth the paper it's written on. This is the most fundamental component of an FBA, a direct observation of the student. So, one, you oftentimes see there is no direct observation of the student, or it occurs in the wrong setting. If in the example above, Jack's behavior occurs on the playground, yet the observation of Jack is done in the classroom, you know, we're really not going to understand much about Jack's behavior because we didn't observe it in the setting where it occurs. So there's also oftentimes you see one of the issues is there's no baseline data collected where the frequency of the target behavior, which we talked about, and the frequency of the replacement or the desired behavior. And maybe there's oftentimes the direct assessment doesn't include any discussion of the antecedents or the consequences. These are all things you have to look for when one of your kids gets an FBA. You should be involved in the development of it, and in being involved in the development of it, you want to be sure that these issues do not occur. Next. You know, it's hard to do data analysis if you have no baseline data from the direct observation. The hypothesis statement. Oftentimes you'll see it does not state the function of the target behavior. It never tells you what the function is. Is it to get something? Is it to escape or avoid something? Is it to send some different kind of message? What's the purpose? I see a lot of FBAs that do not include the threefold statement we talked about. When X occurs, the student does Y in order to achieve Z. It is really important that the hypothesis statement be phrased in this threefold statement approach. It is the most simplistic, the most user-friendly approach to looking at the function of a kid's behavior. And then the testing of the hypothesis statement. It doesn't matter how good you think your hypothesis statement is, or how good an IEP team thinks their hypothesis statement is about the function of a kid's behavior. If you don't test it, you're never going to know if the hypothesis statement is accurate. So you really need to test the hypothesis statement as well. So for a kid who's got major reading issues, skill deficits, one way to test whether or not the kid is engaging in escape behavior is to sit down with that kid as a teacher and use reading material that's at a lower level and see whether or not, figure out where the kid's reading level actually is. Is the kid's reading, first, sit down individually with the kid and use reading material that is at the classroom level and see if the kid can do it. If the kid cannot, then you know that the material you're teaching is at a frustrational level for that kid, and that's why the kid is acting out. They can't do that work. So you then have to lower the reading material to some level where you find where the kid is actually reading at. And then you will realize that the kid's skills are not where they need to be. But when you teach the kid at where their skills are, the kid can learn. So, and if a kid knows that they're going to be taught at the level they're at, there'll be no reason to escape. So that is one way to test a hypothesis statement for a kid you think is engaging in, talking out loud, irrelevant behavior in order to escape. If you think the kid is doing it in order to escape, one reason the kid may need to escape is because of a skill deficit. You need to determine whether the kid has that skill deficit, and testing the hypothesis is the point of that. So it is easy to do, but if you don't test your hypothesis, you're never going to know for sure. Okay, so now who conducts the functional behavioral assessment? So those are some of the issues that I have seen throughout my career. Interviews are not done with the appropriate folks. There's no direct observation of the student, or the observation is done in the wrong setting, and no baseline data is collected. The hypothesis statement. There's not one, or it's not the threefold statement that people can understand. And there's no testing of the hypothesis statement to see if it's true. So, remember, be looking to see if those are issues in any FBA you're involved in. All right, the FBA is done by the IEP team. It should also be done by someone, not only the IEP team, but also someone who is knowledgeable about behavior. This can be a social worker, a school psychologist, a behavioral analyst, but you need somebody who, is trained in behavioral issues. And most of the behavioral information should be collected by the social worker, school psychologist, behavior analyst, what have you. But the student records, all the other data that's going to be looked at regarding skill deficits, performance deficits, this can be collected by the teacher and other IEP team members. But the bottom line is, once the behavior information and then the skill and performance deficit information and all the records are collected, all that information is reviewed by the IEP team, by the IEP team as a whole. And it is the IEP team as a whole that's responsible for coming up with the hypothesis statement and for agreeing on some strategy for testing it. Okay? So, that's what you need to know as a parent or as a guardian. You are a critical player in the conducting of an FBA. You are a critical player and have a significant role to play. So don't allow yourself to be marginalized. You have a lot to contribute. And you should always be interviewed. And you can always make sure all of these other elements are followed in conducting the FBA. So your role is very important. Okay, behavior intervention plans. There are peer-reviewed research standards for behavior intervention plans. And they are, I'm now going to go over these standards in the next several slides. But these are peer-reviewed standards. And under IDEA, if there are peer-reviewed standards, school districts have to use them. So here's the first thing we know about peer-reviewed research involving behavior intervention plans. The person responsible for implementing the behavior intervention plan, or persons, for kids in middle school, they may have several teachers. If there were issues are in classrooms, then it may be the teacher implementing the behavior intervention plan. But the person responsible for implementing the behavior intervention plan, they have to be listed in the plan. You have to know who's really in charge of implementing this plan. The baseline data, a student's problem, i.e. target behaviors, must be in the behavior intervention plan. We need to know what is the frequency of the target, i.e. problem behavior. We also need to know in the behavior intervention plan, we need to also know what is the frequency of the replacement, i.e. desired behavior. We need to know both rates. Both need to be listed in the plan so we know where we're beginning. If in reading a kid has a target behavior rate of 80%, 4 out of every 5 times they engage in a behavior, they engage in the problematic behavior, and only 1 out of 5 times they raise their hand or they sit quietly, then their target behavior rate is 80%, and their compliance or replacement, i.e. desired behavior rate, oftentimes also called the compliance rate, is only 20%. If that's not listed in the behavior intervention plan, we don't know where the kid's starting at. So you always take that from the FBA and you put it in the behavior intervention plan because it provides the foundation for the behavior intervention plan. Next, we need to have a timeline for assessing the faithful implementation of the behavior intervention plan. We need to be looking regularly to ensure that the behavior intervention plan is being implemented. In my experience, the last 25 years when behavior intervention plans have been required under the law in IDEA, I would say really only half of them have been implemented. The kids that I've worked with that have behavior intervention plans, only half of them are being implemented faithfully. Only half. And if no one's checking regularly to see if it's being implemented, you can go a whole semester and it's only implemented like half the time. And a behavior intervention plan is not going to be successful if it's only done half the time. It's like anything else in life. If you only do it half the time, you're not going to be very successful at it. So a kid's not going to get there. You're not going to put a kid in a position to really facilitate changes in his or her behavior if the plan's only being implemented half of the time. So it's really important to check initially when you do a behavior intervention plan on a weekly basis to be sure it's being implemented faithfully. After 6 weeks of checking weekly, you can then move to bi-weekly. But who's ever in charge of implementing the plan needs to know that this plan is being monitored weekly to ensure that you, the teacher, or you, the playground monitor, are implementing it faithfully. So this kind of look behind. When adults know that someone's going to be checking something, they're no different than kids. They're more likely to do it. So you want to be sure that you monitor the implementation of the plan at least weekly for the first 6 weeks, then bi-weekly thereafter. Now, who's going to be responsible? You have to list in the behavior intervention plan who's responsible for assessing the implementation, the faithful implementation of the plan. So we know we want to monitor whether it's being implemented weekly or bi-weekly. But who's going to do that monitoring? It can't be the person responsible for implementing the plan. They obviously have a conflict of interest. So the behavior intervention plan needs to list somebody who's going to monitor whether the person responsible for implementing it is really implementing it. But that cannot be the teacher or the playground monitor. It needs to be someone without a conflict of interest. Very important. Next. Separate from monitoring whether the behavior intervention plan is being implemented, we need to monitor and evaluate changes in the student's target, i.e. problem behaviors, and their desired behaviors. So we need to evaluate, is the plan working? So we need to look at a timeline for collecting and analyzing behavioral progress data. Most literature on behavior intervention plans say you want to collect this information initially on a weekly basis, at least for the first 6 weeks. After the first 6 weeks, once again, you can do it on a bi-weekly basis. But if we want to see if a kid's behavior is really changing, we don't wait 6 weeks. We look at it every week initially to see, even if it doesn't change the first week or two, is it changing by the third or the fourth week? And the only way we're going to know that is if we look at it every week. So for the first 6 weeks, we should evaluate changes in the kid's behavior weekly. After that, we should look at it on a bi-weekly basis. But rest assured, if after 6 weeks looking at it weekly, a kid's behavior is not changing, we should be looking at revising the behavior intervention plan as well. So this is one of the important features of, looking to see, separate from is the plan being implemented, the next thing is the plan working? If it is being implemented, does it work? And the only way to tell that is, as I noted, to be looking at it regularly. So if it's not working after 6 weeks, it should be revised. We shouldn't wait a semester, because within a semester, if the kid's behavior doesn't change, they could be failing. We don't want to set a kid up for failure. We want to change the kid's behaviors to put the kid in a position where they can learn, and learn as much as possible so that they can succeed. So what's the timeline for monitoring changes in the kid's behavior? 1 week for the first 6 weeks, bi-weekly after that. And if it's working after, let's say, 3 months, you can probably go to a monthly basis. But that's after 3 months. So you want a lot of checking on it. Next, we talked about PBIS, positive reinforcers. There's a ton of peer-reviewed research showing that positive reinforcers work for kids. We shouldn't be too surprised by that because they work for us as adults. When we're positively reinforced, when they're positive reinforcers for us, they work as well. We know that from our own lives. But here's the thing about positive reinforcers. They must include a pattern of positive reinforcement. It should include, and it also should include, the student's input as to what are positive reinforcers. If you're using reinforcers that you think are positive, but they don't mean anything to the student, then they're not positive, because they have to be positive to the student. And if they're meaningless to a student, that's not positive. So we want there to be positive reinforcers. And here's the thing we know, that if we take an interest inventory from the student, we will be able to determine what positive reinforcers really work with that student. And reinforcers vary per student. We all know kids, every kid has different likes and dislikes. Some of them, you put 10 kids in a room, some of them may like 3 things, that they share in common, but they're going to like a lot of different things. So by using an interest inventory, we can determine what positive reinforcers work for a kid. Is critical. Oftentimes, in putting together a behavior intervention plan, people want to do it, and they want to develop positive reinforcers when there's been no interest inventory. Reschedule a meeting. Ask that an interest inventory be given to your son or daughter, and then reconvene after that inventory has been taken. So when you find out what positive reinforcers matter to your son or daughter, you may know some of them already, but you might be surprised. So ask that an interest inventory be taken. Number 2, here's what we know about positive reinforcers. If you want to change a kid's behavior, that kid's going to need 4 positive reinforcers for every negative. We need to have every kid needs 4 positives to every negative in order to change his or her behavior. So one of the things that I see in behavior intervention plans is they always focus on the consequences, the negatives for a kid, and they don't focus enough on the positive reinforcers, and they don't focus on how's that plan going to be implemented. So throughout the day, the kid's going to get a 4-to-1 ratio of positive to negative reinforcers. Because without that, it is difficult to change kids' behaviors. Unless, of course, they have a skill or performance deficit, and we've learned how we can do that. But for other kids whose behaviors aren't related to that, they're going to need 4 positives to every negative. So if the plan doesn't explain how opportunities are going to be created to provide 4 positive reinforcers for every negative, it's likely not to work. Varying reinforcers. You got to include more than 1 or 2 positive reinforcers to ensure a student doesn't get bored. So if on an interest inventory a kid has identified 8 positive reinforcers that he or she likes, then you should be using all 8. Because if you use the same ones over and over again, it's like anything. You're going to kids get tired of it, just like adults do. Next. This is very important. This is the most important slide on behavior intervention plans. The most important. You know, the replacement behavior rate, the desired behavior rate in a behavior intervention plan, oftentimes known as the compliance rate, this has to be tied to and realistic in light of the current replacement behavior rate that a kid has. If a kid in reading class is acting out 4 out of every 5 times they have an opportunity to engage in appropriate behavior, if they act out 4 out of 5 times, then their target behavior rate is 80%, and their replacement desired behavior rate in reading is 20%. Now, as I said before, that baseline data needs to be in the behavior intervention plan. Because when a district then says, well, we have an 80% replacement, i.e., desired behavior rate for every student and every student's behavior intervention plan, you're going to know that that's not going to work. If the student is at a 20%, or I give an example here, a 25% replacement rate, their desired behaviors only occur 25% of the time. Imposing an 80% rate tomorrow, 24 hours from now, means that kid, that rate is completely unrealistic. It's not related to the kid's current desired behavior rate, and it will cause the behavior intervention to fail. This I can swear to. The number one reason that behavior intervention plans fail is because the replacement, the desired behavior rate that is established in the behavior intervention plan, is usually 2 to 3 or 4 times greater than where the kid's current desired behavior rate is at. So within a 24-hour period, we expect a kid to go from 25% desired behavior rate to 80% tomorrow. It doesn't work. It's not going to happen. Yet we impose this on children all the time. And then we wonder why their behavior intervention plans are not working. If a kid's at 25%, if their problem behaviors are at 80%, 4 out of 5 times they engage in a problem behavior, and only 1 out of 5 times they engage in a desired behavior, then they're not going to switch tomorrow to engaging in the desired behavior 4 times and the bad behavior 1 time. It's not going to happen. What will work for a kid who's at a 20% rate, or in this example, 25%, is to, in the behavior intervention plan, say within the first month you're going to increase the rate to 35 to 40%. So the kid's only giving you the right behavior 1 out of 5 times. within a month, you're going to try to get to 33% on that rate. You're going to go from 1 out of, let's say it's at 25%, 1 out of 4 times to 1 out of 3 times. Every 3 times the kid has a chance to engage in appropriate behavior, you want to see that happen. One time. Not at 80%. So you do it incrementally. You move a kid who's at 25% to 33%, then to 40%, then to 50%, then to 2/3, then to 3/4. So you do it incrementally so the kids can succeed. It is important to all of us to be in a position to succeed and not to fail. Kids do feel bad about themselves when they fail. And if you tell a kid starting tomorrow, you got to be at 80% desired behavior rate, when you're currently at 20%, they're going to fail. And they're going to feel like a failure, and they're going to feel like they can't do it. And we have set, the adults, we have set that kid up for failure. And it can be a student with Prader-Willi syndrome, kid who has issues about food. And yet we are saying that the kid's behavior tomorrow has to be 4 out of 5 times the kid behavior has to be what we would consider the desired or perfect behavior, when the kid's currently only at 1 out of 5 times does that occur. If we say that to the kid, say starting tomorrow, we've set that kid up for failure, and that is on us, not on the kid. So the baseline data is critical on a behavior intervention plan to figure out where we're starting and what is a realistic goal for the first month. Kids at 25% desired behavior, let's increase the kid to 33% at the end of the first month. Let's go to 45% at the end of the second month. Let's go to 60%. Something incremental to get the kid up to 80%. It may take 3 or 4 months to get to 80%, but all along the way, the kid can be succeeding. The kid can gradually be increasing their behavior, which they can do. Kids can gradually and incrementally improve their behavior. They cannot radically improve their behavior overnight. And how do we know this? How do we really know that's true? I mean, how do we know that I'm just not uttering a bunch of nonsense? Here's how we know. And this is what I say to adults when we're doing behavior intervention plans. Do you think a kid can go from 25 to 80% desired behavior tomorrow? Let's look at us. How have we done in instances where we've identified behaviors that we need to change? How well have we done in changing our behaviors immediately? And the example I use is New Year's resolutions. If you sit in a room with 10 people, imagine right now we're in a room with 10 people, and I say to the people in the room, how many of you are still making New Year's resolutions? Now think about it. There's 10 of us. Think in your mind and make a guess. How many people do you think are making New Year's resolutions today out of 10 people? The answer to that is 2. 20% of the people in the room are still making New Year's resolutions. What about the other 8 out of 10 people who are no longer making New Year's resolutions? Why are they no longer doing it? The reason they don't have New Year's resolutions anymore is because they couldn't keep them. Very simple. People don't give up New Year's resolutions who are reaching their New Year's resolutions. They keep making new ones. But if you can't reach your New Year's resolutions and you repeatedly have trouble, you stop making them. So we know that 80% of people in America don't even make New Year's resolutions anymore because they couldn't keep them. And what are New Year's resolutions? They're behaviors that adults without disabilities have identified they need to change. Behavior they need to change. And how successful have they been at changing their behaviors? 80% of them don't even make New Year's resolutions anymore about behaviors they need to change because they couldn't change their behaviors. The other 20% who make the New Year's resolutions, of that small pool of people, only 8 to 12% of people are able to keep their New Year's resolutions. So for every 100 people who make a New Year's resolution, only 8 to 12 of those folks are able to reach and keep or attain their New Year's resolution. 8 to 12%. We're adults without disabilities, and only 8 to 12% of us can fulfill our New Year's resolution. Behaviors we've identified we need to change. 88 to 92% of us are unable to change behaviors that we know we need to change. And yet, we're expecting kids to go from 25% replacement behavior, desired behavior compliance rates to 80% or more. We're not able to do that. Yet we're going to impose that standard on kids? Really? It's interesting. There's a lot of research done by the University of Scranton on New Year's resolutions in America. And I think adults, I always tell adults, I go over this research with them. They need to think about this in the context of what kinds of behavior compliance rates are going to establish for students. They need to think about how they've done changing their behavior so that they can understand how hard it really is and that you can't radically change your behavior overnight, be you a child or an adult. But by going over the research from University of Scranton, it creates a context for adults about what they're expecting of children. So here's some of the research. What percentage of people who make New Year's resolutions quit after 1 month? Now remember, can kids quit on their behavior intervention plan after 1 month? No. But what percentage of adults quit on New Year's resolutions after 1 month? 40%. 40%. Now think about that. Kids are told starting tomorrow for the rest of the school year, if it's September, for the next 8 months, every day, we want you at an 80% compliance rate. Adults, with respect to New Year's resolutions, very comparable analogy. 40% of them can't maintain an 80% rate even throughout the course of 1 month, and they quit after 1 month. How many adults quit on their New Year's resolutions after 3 months? Now remember, kids don't get to quit after 3 months, but what percentage of adults who make New Year's resolutions quit after 3 months? Because they can't change their behavior after 3 months. 66%. 2 out of 3 adults. This is startling information that adults need to have when they want to and do have all the power with respect to dictating what children's behavior should be. Again, as I said, they need to think about this. 2 out of 3 adults quit from trying to change their behavior after 3 months. Kids have no such luxury. But what it tells you is it's hard. It's really hard to change behavior. And adults, trust me, if they could change their behavior at an 80% rate every day over 3 months, 80% compliance rate every day for 3 months, they wouldn't be quitting. They're nowhere near an 80% compliance rate. And that's why adults fail as well. Because we create New Year's resolutions that result in radical changes of behavior. We want to radically change our behavior starting tomorrow. It doesn't happen. So, and then let's get to the bottom line. After 6 months, now a school year is 9 months. After 6 months, what percentage of adults are still implementing their New Year's resolution? 15%. Only 15% of adults who make New Year's resolutions are even implementing them after 6 months. A kid still has 3 more months in the school year. It's almost, 85% of adults can't do it for 6 months. 40% quit after 1 month, 2/3 quit after 3 months, and 85% quit within 6 months. And yet kids are expected to change their behavior radically starting tomorrow and for every day of a school year for up to 9 months. We need to put this in context. And New Year's resolutions puts it in context for adults. I have never been to an IEP meeting where when I have raised the issue of New Year's resolution, have the people at the table insisted upon an 80% compliance rate? Not one. Because once they understand this in the context of their behavior, they know how unrealistic 80 or 100% is for a kid who's at 25%. It is like what we could declare to be mission impossible. But unless we give adults a context for understanding that, they'll come into the room and gladly say oftentimes, too often, that we want an 80% or 100% compliance rate starting tomorrow. So remember, if you want to get an incremental increase in a kid's compliance rate, which is what a behavior intervention plan should include, it should include incremental increases. The best way to get there is to give a context to the adults in the room for their behaviors. And the best way to do that is through New Year's resolutions. It works. It works every time. Now, who develops behavior intervention plans? Behavior intervention plans are developed by the student's IEP team. It's very important to know that. You are a major player in the development of your students' behavior intervention plans. So read that research from the University of Scranton on New Year's resolutions. And here's one more tip on behavior. In developing a behavior intervention plan, in addition to the New Year's resolution tactic, it's important to remind adults in the room of their frequency in speeding. Usually when I go into a behavior intervention plan, I look around the room and I ask the adults in the room, how many of them have sped today? How many of them engage in speeding today on their way to school? If there's 10 adults in the room, how many adults do you think typically raise their hand? And on the way to school, they at some point in their drive, they sped. 8 or 9 is the answer. 8 or 9 people sitting in the room, coming, we're all here to talk about a student's behavior. 8 or 9 of those people have engaged in a behavior that is illegal and is highly dangerous. 500,000 people in the United States are injured every year by people speeding. 500,000 people. 16,000 Americans are killed every year by people who engage in speeding. And yet you can sit in a room at the beginning of a behavior intervention plan and see that 9 out of 10 people have engaged in that illegal, dangerous behavior before the meeting has even started about your client's behavior. Now, I like to say, who's engaging in more dangerous behavior here? My client, who has a habit of talking back to a teacher, or has a habit related to food that you don't like, is that behavior dangerous? No. So who's engaged in dangerous behavior here today? Yeah, the vast majority of us. It gives a context to students' behaviors. We come into these rooms for behavior intervention plans, everyone talks like there are serious problems with our client's behavior. Many times our client's behaviors are minor. I'm not excusing the behavior, I am not. But it's not dangerous behavior. And it's not illegal behavior under the law, which, by the way, 9 out of 10 people in the room have already engaged in before we've started talking. So again, behavior is something that we need to put behavior in a context. I get that my client engages in behaviors that can be problematic in a school culture. And I get that they need to change, but let's put them in context. You all have engaged in behavior that is dangerous, that can cost somebody their life. And in this country, injures over 500,000 people a year and kills over 16,000 people a year. You're engaging in that kind of behavior, likely on a daily basis. So let's have a context for my client's behavior. Yes, it is problematic. Yes, it needs to change. But horrible? Awful? Really serious? I don't think so. Dangerous? I don't think so. If we want to talk about those behaviors, we should be developing behavior intervention plans for the adults in the room. So let's just think about that as we look at developing this plan for my client. And I'm not trying to be harsh, I'm just trying to be realistic here. So again, it's important in the area of behaviors to give adults context for their actions. And the best way to give adults context for their actions is to give adults context about their own behaviors and how that should affect their actions with respect to children. So that is going to conclude the section on functional behavioral assessments and behavior intervention plans. I hope this information has been helpful. and I'm hopeful it's been helpful to you. And as you can tell in my voice that I get a little worked up, because these are critical issues for kids. And we're the adults in the room. We're the ones with all the power. We should always try to exercise that in a fundamentally fair and reasonable fashion. And what is fundamentally fair and reasonable when it comes to children's behaviors? It is understanding those behaviors in the context of our behaviors and our ability to change our behaviors and the types of behaviors that we ourselves engage in. So we are now going to start. So remember, just always try to provide a context for adults. It has a profound effect, as well it should, on how adults view children's behavior when they see it through the lens of their own. Next, related services. This is the third topic we're going to cover. Let me just give you the definition of related services. Related services means transportation and other such developmental, corrective, and other supported services as are required to assist a child with a disability to benefit from special education. Just have to be able to assist a child to benefit. So that's not a real high standard. There are 16 different types of related services listed in IDEA. There are similar related services that you can obtain under Section 504. Now, the related services that I think are relevant for IDEA-eligible students who have behavioral challenges or behavioral disabilities. Some have behavioral disabilities like emotional disturbance or attention deficit hyperactivity disorders. Others may have learning disabilities. It's not a behavioral disability, but the learning disability may manifest itself in behavioral challenges that kids have. Same thing for kids with traumatic brain injuries. Sometimes kids with autism have manifest behavioral challenges. So, the related services I think are helpful to kids with behavioral related disabilities or with disabilities that have behavioral manifestations at times. I think they are psychological services, counseling services, social work services, and parent counseling and training. For kids with Prader-Willi syndrome, I think occupational therapy is also just something that is very helpful to them as well, separate from behaviors. Just occupational therapy, I think, will be very helpful, so I'm going to cover that as well. So what do we know? Let's start with psychological services. The first thing I would say about related services is if you're seeking a related service for your son or daughter or relative, you want to go to the definition of that related service. Because oftentimes in our school, and I don't say this derogatorily at all, but oftentimes in schools, the perception of what psychological services is may be only one of these 4 bullets that you're now looking at on the screen. Psychological service is not one thing. It's actually, under the law, 4 different kinds of services. What do psychological services include? Obtaining and interpreting information about a child's behavior and conditions related to learning. Consulting with other staff members and planning school programs. to meet the special education needs of children, such as psychological tests, interviews, direct observation, behavioral evaluations like functional behavioral assessments, assisting in developing positive behavioral intervention strategies, PBIS. It should say positive behavioral intervention and support strategies. Planning and managing a program of psychological services, including counseling for children and parents. Many school districts, when you sit down to talk about psychological services, only talk about the last bullet. Yet there are three other kinds of psychological services you can ask for. So it is very important to always look at the definition of the particular related service you are interested in. I want to have a little sip of water here. So, instead of just counseling, psychological services can include the following: observation of a student in a school setting where behavioral issues occur. You can ask for that as a psychological service. I want a school psychologist to go and observe my student, my son or daughter, in the school setting where he or she are having problematic behaviors. That's a psychological service I want. That's a related service that I want. You can get also interviews with the student, the parents, the teachers, all the things we talked about, like for an FBA. You can get that as part of an FBA, or you can say as a related service, I just want these interviews done by a psychologist to try to figure out what's going on. You can also ask as a psychological service that the school psychologist review attendance record and discipline incidents and give you feedback on what he or she thinks is occurring in these discipline incidents and attendance records. You can also ask the school psychologist to conform a curriculum-based assessment to check whether the student's behaviors are related to skill or performance deficits. Now, these are all things that are separate and apart from psychological counseling, which is the only thing that ever seems to get talked about under psychological services. Guess what else? There are three other things you can ask for under psychological services. You want the psychologist to consult with school personnel to develop appropriate school programs, including a behavior intervention plan with the IEP team. So this should really say you want the psychologist to consult with school personnel and you in order to develop an appropriate behavior intervention plan. You want the psychologist to help develop and implement PBIS strategies. You could say separate from a behavior intervention plan, just develop some. I think they should be part of a behavior intervention plan, but I'm just saying conceivably you could just ask for this. And then number 7, the one that you typically see, providing counseling services, but not only to a student. You can also ask for joint counseling to both the student and you as his or her parents. This is rarely discussed as an option under psychological services. Not only psychological counseling for the student, you can get joint counseling for you and your son or daughter. So, knowing the definition of each related service you're interested in is very important. Social work. Look at the definition here. Group and individual counseling. That's what most people are looking for. Except most people think social work is individual. It could be group counseling as well. This second bullet is critical. In all of the IEP meetings I've attended, over 1,000, I don't say this disparagingly, I say this as a matter of fact. Not in a single instance has anyone in discussing social work services talked about mobilizing school and community resources to enable a child to learn as effectively as possible in his or her educational program. And yet this is one of the components of social work that's in the law, the definition. Mobilizing school and community resources. So when I go in and want social work services, I always talk about what school and community resources are we going to, is a social worker going to mobilize to enable my client, your son or daughter, to learn as effectively as possible in his or her educational program. Now that is something. And then also assisting in the development of positive behavioral intervention strategies. Notice that both under psychological services and social work services, PBIS is something that falls under each of those related services. It is important to know this. So, what can you get as far as social work services? You can get providing counseling to the student, but you can also get providing counseling to the parent and other family members if desired. Very important. Number two, you can get through social work services obtaining community services that will support a student in achieving the same academic and or behavioral skills that he or she is working on at school. So, community services that will support a student in achieving the academic and behavioral skills they are working on. So what are examples of community services? Community mental health resources. Adult mentors through Big Brother, Big Sister can help. Friendship and peer mentor opportunities. Boys and Girls Clubs, Cub Scouts, Boy Scouts. These are things kids may need for behavioral purposes, for role models. You can get this through the related service of social work. Recruiting a community volunteer to assist a student at school, maybe with academic issues or with behavioral issues. This can be a social work service that you want the social worker to identify and to recruit a community volunteer. It is never discussed unless you yourself are going to bring it up. So it's very important to know the definition and developing and implementing PBIS strategies to use with the student. That's another social work service. It's just not counseling. So, but it's going to be up to you, up to each of you who are listening to this, to advocate for these services that are within the definition of social work and, as we covered before, psychological services. Okay, the Department of Education has also said that social work is not limited to the three services within the definition. And those three services are right here: group and individual counseling with the child and family, mobilizing school and community resources, and developing PBIS. Social work service is not limited to those three alone. And here's the other thing about social work and psychological services. They can be provided to address behavioral issues that occur in both non-academic and extracurricular activities and settings, not just within the classroom. So we can address behavioral issues on the school bus, in the cafeteria, in an after-school program. You know, both social work and psychological services can be provided to address non-academic settings, extracurricular settings, hallways, cafeterias, playground, after-school programs. So just remember that. It is important to remember that as well. After-school programs that are run by a school, after-school programs run by a school, related services can be provided in those programs. Occupational therapy. It is important to know the definition. One, it has to be provided by a qualified occupational therapist, not assistant, not occupational tech, occupational therapist. It includes, what is occupational therapy? What is it supposed to address? It includes improving, developing, or restoring functions impaired or lost through illness, injury, or deprivation. Improving the ability to perform tasks for independent functioning if functions are impaired or lost. And preventing through early intervention, initial or further impairment or loss of function. These three bullets are very broad, but it is important to couch your request for occupational therapy within one of these defining criteria. It's not just enough to say, I think my kid needs related services for occupational therapy for the following reason. My kid needs it to improve or to help develop or restore the following functions, or to improve his or her ability to perform the following tasks of independent function and living, and to also prevent the initial or further impairment or loss of these functions. So it is very important that you tailor your request for occupational therapy within these defining criteria, one of them or more. But just don't talk in generalities. Use the terms that are within the law itself. And talk about the functions that are being restored or that are being improved or that you don't want any further loss of. You know, talk about those functions in the context of the criteria themselves. Okay? Occupational therapy, but you got to know the definition which includes those criteria in order to talk about it, obviously. Parent counseling and training. You know, this is a related service. And here's what parent counseling and training can include. Assisting parents in understanding the special needs of their child. For parents of students with Prader-Willi syndrome, it can include counseling and training and helping you understand. You may feel you don't need that. But if that would be helpful to you, you can get, not only is it counseling, but training in understanding the special needs of your kids. Providing parents with information about child development in light of Prader-Willi syndrome. Helping parents to acquire skills. This is parent counseling and training, can include helping parents to acquire skills that will allow them to support the implementation of their child's IEP. Now this is really important. So you can get training on the skills, positive behavior interventions and supports that they're using at school. You can be trained on those as well, so you can utilize those in your household with your son or daughter. So parent counseling and training is also very broad, and it's something you should always look at. If you think this would be helpful to you, you should request it. Oftentimes, you may feel, well, the counseling may or may not help me, but I want the training. Or you may feel, you know what, the counseling would be helpful to me. But, you know, it's not just one. It's not just parent counseling. It's counseling and training, and it can be one or the other. So, parent counseling and training can include a social worker or a school psychologist providing training to help parents acquire any skills necessary to implement a behavior intervention plan. If there are components of a behavior intervention plan that you believe you would like to implement it at home, you can ask for training on those components so that they can be implemented in your house. That's very important, very important. So, of course, it assumes that you agree with what's in the behavior intervention plan. But based upon the training we've done today on behavior intervention plans and functional behavioral assessments, I'm hoping it's far more likely you're going to like the functional behavior assessment that is initially done and the behavior intervention plan that flows from that. Because now you know what needs to be in both of those. So, parent counseling and training is also an important related service. Okay. Just a few comments, separate from the related services themselves, about related services. You want to have annual related services goals. Oftentimes, if your son or daughter has an IEP, what you will get under related services, let's say you get psychological services, even though the IEP requires measurable annual academic and functional, i.e. behavioral goals, the IEP says there has to be annual goals. In related service, the IEP document far too often just lists the type of related service and its frequency and duration. So it'll say social work services, 1 time a week for 30 minutes. That's all it'll say. It won't say one thing about what's being provided within the social work service. It just says social work service, 1 time a week, 30 minutes a week. There are no annual related services goals. There are no goals at all. It will also typically list the projected start date, and as I mentioned above, the frequency, duration, and oftentimes lists the location of the related service. It's required in the IEP. But you won't see any annual goals. So, if there's no annual related services goals for like psychological services, social work services, then think about it. It's not going to be possible to know if the psychological, in this example here, if the related service, social work, is even going to address your student's problem behavior. If all it says is social work 1 time a week, 30 minutes a week, how do you know it's going to address what the problem is your kid's having? Second, no annual goals. The parents and or the students have no input into the goals for the related service, i.e. social work. Moreover, the parent and the student won't know if the related services goals are being implemented or met. So really, and 4, parents will not be able to support their students' pursuit of any annual related services goals. Should write the word annual in there. This is why it is so important not just to have the frequency and duration of related services on an IEP. You need to have input into what the goals are going to be sure they address the problem behaviors, and so that you can then track whether or not those goals are being met. And so that you can also support, your students' pursuit of those goals, and support a social worker or a psychologist who's providing those services. So annual goals for related services are critical. Now, here's what we know about annual goals for related services. It's kind of the flip side of the previous slide. Annual goals we should be sure the annual related service goals addresses the student's problem, i.e. target behavior. It includes specific appropriate behaviors, as we know, called replacement behaviors that will be taught. So one is addressing the target problem behaviors, and there's also teaching and manifesting the desired, i.e. appropriate behaviors we want the kid to increase. The annual goal should include a description of the psychological, social work, or counseling services that will be used to help the student develop the appropriate behaviors. What are the types of social work services that will be provided to help the student develop a more frequent manifestation or a more frequent display of appropriate behaviors? So what are specifically those services? And remember, we should always ask, all right, you want to do this service? Is it peer-reviewed, research-based? Should always ask for psychological and social work services when they say, here's the kind of counseling I'm going to do. If they say counseling, it's not mobilizing community services. Is there peer-reviewed research for this type of counseling? Is there? You can ask in a very respectful way, but you want to know, is there? And could you make that available to me so I could read it? Very important. Many psychologists and social workers have never been asked that. Is there peer-reviewed research for the type of counseling service? We're talking about counseling now that you're going to provide. Would you please provide me with a link so I can look at the research on it? 4th, annual related service goals should include any teaching or consulting goals for school personnel and for family members. Any work that a social worker or psychologist is going to do with the teachers should also be listed as part of the annual goal. One of the annual goals is to work with the teacher on developing the following behaviors for that teacher. So, how to provide 4 positive reinforcers to a kid for every negative. How we train teachers to do that. That's not about the kid. That's about the teacher. So part of a related service for social work can be working with the teacher to provide 4 opportunities or a positive reinforcer for every negative reinforcer. So that's why annual goals are important. Then we track whether or not that's happening. Both the goals for the student and the goals for the teacher. There'll be annual goals that are related to whether things are changing with the teacher. We will need to track that as well. So it's very important. Now, progress reports. If you don't have annual goals, if all you have is related services, 1 time a week, 30 minutes a week, 1, we don't know what the service is. 2, we don't know what the goal is. And 3, progress reports are required under IDEA. How do you provide progress on the following? Social work, 1 time a week, 30 minutes a week. You can't. The law says an IEP, which will include the related service, let's say of social work or whatever related service you're looking for, if it's on the IEP, the law says that the IEP must include a description of how the child's progress toward meeting the IEP annual goals. If you don't have an annual goal for related services, then there's no IEP annual goal for related service. You're not going to get a progress report. Not one. You're not going to get progress reports. So, the law says the IEP must list how the child's progress towards meeting the annual IEP goals will be measured. When periodic reports on the child's progress will be provided. Progress reports are thus tied to annual goals. It's another reason why you must have annual related service goals. If you don't have annual related service goals, you're not going to get ongoing progress reports. So, no annual related service goals, there's no clear method for measuring the student's progress, nor for creating a timetable for providing progress reports. Really critical. For progress report purposes and to ensure, Dan, I just went back a slide, and to ensure that within those annual goals, problem behaviors are being addressed, appropriate behaviors are being taught, the type of service is being listed and enumerated and described, and any training or counseling that is provided to school personnel is also listed. So the annual goals have to be very descriptive, and then you can also designate how often you're going to get progress reports, which will address the annual goals. Very important then to have annual goals. Okay, and then this just shows you what has to be in the progress reports for related services. And it's important, let's take a minute. We have time to do this, let's take a minute. One of the things you're going to want to look at is documentation that the annual related service goals were addressed in each related service session. It's not enough to know that the related service session took place and not know anything about what happened in it. So that's bullet number one. You need objective information and data regarding your son or daughter's progress toward the annual related service goals. It should reflect your son or daughter's rate of engaging in both the target behavior and the appropriate behavior at the beginning and at the end of the period covered by the progress report. You want to know what was going on when related services started, with the rate of appropriate and inappropriate behaviors, and at the time of the progress report, typically 6 to 9 weeks later, what's going on now with both problem and appropriate behavior rates. You also want to know in the progress report the number of sessions provided and the number of minutes per session that were provided compared to the number of sessions and minutes per session listed on the IEP. So, you want in that progress report, you do want to know if the sessions occurred. Because if the sessions occurred, it's more likely your son or daughter is going to reach their annual goals. If there was no session, if half the sessions didn't occur, the odds of your son or daughter reaching their annual goals, annual related service goals, has gone down dramatically. And so any difference between what was required in the IEP and what was actually provided, if only 3/4 were provided, there has to be an explanation of why 1/4 of those services were not provided. That's another reason that you want progress reports, because it's one way to see what percentage of the sessions were provided. And not only what percentage were provided, were they provided for the full length required in the IEP. So remember, you're going to want annual goals, and then you're going to want, within the IEP, in the area of related services, you're going to want to specify these 3 things for what needs to be in the progress report and when it needs to be issued to you. It's typically every 6 to 9 weeks at the end of each grading period, which typically is every 9 weeks. Okay, here's what I oftentimes see about related services. They're not individualized based on need. Oftentimes most kids are getting the same level of social work. If a kid's getting social work, every kid's getting 1 time a week, 30 minutes a week. That's not individualized. That's one size fits all. So that's one of the things you want to be aware of. The level of related services, the frequency and duration, i.e. currently 1 time a week, 30 minutes a week, has little or no relation to the student's problem behavior. It's like I just said, it's one size fits all. If a student really needs 60 minutes a week, but every student gets 30 minutes a week, it's really not related to the problem behaviors and what it's going to take to turn those around. The level of related services, as I just said, insufficient to cause changes in the student's behavior. How do we know it's insufficient? The student's behavior is not changing. That's one way to tell if it's insufficient. 30 minutes a week, if it's not changing a student's behavior, it's not likely it's sufficient. It's one clear indication. Also with related services, there's a failure to adjust the intensity or frequency to cause changes in a student's behavior. The students at 1 time a week for social work, 30 minutes a week, their behaviors aren't changing, and let's say they're getting worse. The frequency and duration is rarely, if ever, changed. It's only looked at annually. But we know that if a kid is not making progress academically or behaviorally, we've covered this before, then an IEP team is supposed to reconvene and re-examine the services that are being provided in order to ensure that the kid will start making progress either academically or behaviorally. So if a kid's getting 1 time a week, 30 minutes a week of social work, and their behavior is getting worse, that IEP team needs to get together. Not at the end of the year, not once a year, but they need to get together early in the semester if the kids' behaviors are getting worse or they're simply not improving, and look at increasing the frequency and duration. 2 times a week, 30 minutes each time. That's 60 minutes now a week would be something to look at in order to address the lack of progress behaviorally. Okay. Or in order to reduce, if a student is suddenly being referred for disciplinary purposes, in order to reduce discipline referrals, the IEP team needs to meet and look at increasing the level of the frequency and duration of related services. Okay, that is the end of that session. Here's a quick summary. Over the past 45 years, most related services that have been provided in the context of only one of the criteria within a definition of a related service. Psychological and social work, the almost universal focus for these 2 related services has been counseling. But within the definition of each of these, there are anywhere from 2 to 4 other types of services that can be provided, separate from and or in addition to counseling. So it is critical to know what the definitions of related services are and what kinds of services can thus be provided. They're far more expansive than the discussion that we often find ourselves in at IEP meetings on social work and psychological services, for instance. So that's number 1. Number 2, we're going to want annual related services goals. It is absolutely essential that we know what the related service is, what exactly it is, and what the goal for that service is, and what strategies, techniques, or methods are going to be used. If it's counseling, what form of counseling is going to be used? So annual goals, annual related services goals, which clearly define the nature of the service, and which we want to be sure that the nature of that service is peer-reviewed, research-based. And number 3, we're going to want progress reports on our annual related services goals. So those are all critical things. Know the definitions, get annual related services goals, and go back to the slide to ensure you have progress reports being provided on those annual goals that address the three things that were in the previous slide. Just refer back to that slide. But it is very important that you cover those three issues when you're dealing with related services. Okay, now we're going to go to the final section of this module, and that is extended school year services. So, here we go. Most people think extended school year services refers to services in the summer. That is only part of it. Once again, it's important to know the definition of extended school year services in the law. In IDEA and in 504, extended school year services are defined as special education and related services, special education and related services, i.e. the first thing you see is related services have to be provided to kids who need them during extended school years. They are provided to a student with a disability beyond the length of the normal school year. It doesn't say the summer. You can get extended school year services during the winter holiday break. That would be beyond the length of the normal school year. But the whole discussion of extended school year services for the last 40 years has focused on the summer. You can actually get services over the holiday break. That would be beyond the length of the normal school year. So just understand that, number one. Number two, extended school year services are provided in accordance with the student's IEP. Every kid who gets extended school year has to have an extended school year IEP. Not like, hey, here's our program for the summer. When a school district provides extended school year to a kid with a disability, that kid is entitled to an extended school year IEP. And the services must be provided during the extended school year, whether it's the winter holiday or the summer, in accordance with the kid's IEP, and at no cost to the parents. It's part of FAPE, free appropriate public education. Extended school year is a part of that. It is free to the parents. Next. Here's the other thing about extended school year. It has to be considered for every student with a disability. Throughout my career, I have heard that extended school year, well, we only consider that for kids with autism, kids with intellectual disabilities, and kids with traumatic brain injury. We don't consider other kids, they don't need it. Well, you don't know if a kid needs it unless you consider it for a kid. You just can't universally proclaim that only 3 out of the 13 disabilities under IDEA, only 3 of those disabilities, students with those disabilities, will be considered for ESY and nobody else needs it. No. The school district must consider extended school year for every student. That includes for every student who has Prader-Willi syndrome. Every student with Prader-Willi syndrome must be considered for ESY. And as I noted, school districts cannot restrict ESY services to students with autism, or students with intellectual disabilities, or students with traumatic brain injury, or we're only going to provide it to students who are emotionally disturbed. You have to consider all students for extended school year. Okay, usually the goals that are addressed through extended school year services will be an extension of those on the current year IEP. You know, we're extending the year of kids' school year beyond the normal length of the year. We're extending it, and we're typically doing that to work on goals that are within the kid's IEP. The kid gets an extended school year IEP, but it should be related to his regular school year IEP. We're not going to just start working on all kinds of new things. It should be related. Obviously, there will be some new goals. Others may be extended into the summer so a kid can complete them. But it is typically tied to the normal school year IEP, with some exceptions. Next, Eligibility for ESY is determined by a student's IEP team. If hypothetically a district were to say only kids with autism, intellectual disabilities, and traumatic brain injury get ESY, who's making the determination about which kids qualify for ESY? Is it the IEP team or the district? It's the district. And the law says it's each individual IEP team that decides whether a student, regardless of his or her disability, qualifies for ESY. Now, there are three very common criteria for ESY, which I'll come back and cover in a minute. Regression recoupment, critical point of instruction or an emerging skill, critical point for an emerging skill, actually 4. Excessive absences and extenuating circumstances. These are the 4 most common criteria for extended school year. I will cover them in a couple minutes. Okay. Now, when a team develops, we're just going to assume for a second a kid qualifies for ESY. The IEP team develops an ESY IEP that includes measurable goals for the extended school year, the type of service, instructional, behavioral, transition services, or related services that are provided. Now, you're obviously not going to get an annual related service goal in extended school year, but what can you get? You can get an extended school year related service goal. If your kid's going to go to school in the summer or over the winter break, you want goals for that period. I call those extended school year related service goals. Next, you get the amount and duration of each service over the extended school year. And LRE, the least restrictive environment, does apply to ESY services. This is very important. It does apply. Okay, amount and duration of extended school year. Remember I said the third bullet, the IEP team must address the amount and duration of each service provided in an extended school year. So let's look at amount and duration. The amount and duration issue. An IEP team is charged with determining the amount and duration of ESY services for each student. The IEP team determines how many days a week, how many hours a day, how many weeks a kid goes to extended school year. Let's go over that again. How many hours a day, how many days a week, and how many weeks a kid is going to receive extended school year services. That is not decided by a district. They cannot come in and say, we're running an ESY program this year that's 3 days a week from 9 to 12 for 6 weeks. Now let's talk about whether your son or daughter qualifies. No. The IEP team determines the amount, the number of hours a day, the number of days a week, and the number of weeks of extended school year services a student receives. So if you ever hear that the district say, this is our program, that in and of itself violates the law. It's not the district that decides, it's the IEP team. So look at the second bullet. A school district cannot unilaterally limit the type, amount, or duration of ESY services. You can't say, hey, we have a 4-week program, 3 hours a day, 3 days a week. That's what's known as a one-size-fits-all ESY program. You need to highlight that phrase, one size fits all. Whenever someone speaks up and says, here's our program, it's 3 hours a day, 3 days a week for 6 weeks. For my son, no, that's our program for all kids with disabilities this year. That's a one size fits all. It is not individualized, and it's not determined by the IEP committee. So, one size fits all violates IDEA. Now, LRE, least restrictive environment, is an issue for an ESY IEP, just like it is for the normal school year. Many school districts, unfortunately, don't understand that LRE applies to extended school year. So school districts can use general education summer programs, enrichment programs, and things like that to include kids with disabilities in inclusive settings, where they can work on their skills with appropriate SPED personnel, but they're in inclusive settings. Recreational and educational programs. Kids need to be working on behavioral goals. They may want, a school district they shouldn't be running a segregated, self-contained behavior, like emotional disturbance class. Well, we're going to run a class just for kids with Prader-Willi syndrome who have food issues this summer. That's absurd. That's not LRE. So they need to consider LRE, and we know now the importance of inclusion. They need to look at using general education summer programs for inclusion. They need to look at recreational and other educational programs, including private school environments that might offer appropriate programs during the summer. But they have to look at LRE, and they need to make that happen for kids. So just remember, LRE applies. I go into any ESY meeting I've ever been in, I'm saying, one of the things, as we're talking through this today, we're going to have to come to is the issue of LRE. So let's all be thinking about how we're going to make the services that we decide upon if the kid qualifies, how we're going to make those happen in inclusive environments. Puts people on notice at the beginning that we're going to have to be thinking about, as we think about the services, where can they be provided in an inclusive setting? And it's important that people be thinking about that. And rather than just waiting till the end and springing it on people, and then people don't even know what to say. So, okay, LRE applies. ESY decisions must be made timely. The law requires this. Here's what it means. ESY decisions are timely if there is enough time for the parents to appeal a denial of ESY services and obtain those services through a due process hearing or a state administrative complaint prior to the start of extended school year services. So the decision has to be made by a point in time where your son or daughter is denied services and you want to go to due process or file a state complaint, it will be resolved prior to the start of summer school. Otherwise, if they make the decision in early May that your kid's not qualified and you go to due process or file a state complaint, by the time it's decided, the summer may be 3/4 over. And if the due process complaint is decided in your favor and it's ruled that your kid is qualified for extended school year or qualifies for extended school year, 3/4 of the summer is over. You've lost 3/4 of what you're entitled to. So I always say the following. Extended school year should be decided no later than March 15th. March 15th. If you think your kid needs extended school year services, you want it addressed in an IEP meeting by March 15th in case you need to appeal a denial of ESY services. March 15th. Okay, regression recoupment. Here's the definitions. The first one. Without ESY services, a student will regress in one or more critical IEP goals and objectives during a school break, let's say the summer. And they will not recover the skills that they've lost in a reasonable period of time following the school break, the summer. So here's what happens. Your son or daughter has certain skills, or certain academic skills that over the summer they could regress and lose some of those skills. And when they come back to school, it's going to take more than a reasonable period of time for them to recoup the skills that they've lost. It can be academic skills. It can also be they may have modified their behaviors and developed a number of behavioral skills by the end of the school year. And if they're off during the summer, those behavioral skills, they're going to regress in the area of behavior. And when they get back to school, it's going to take them a significant period of time to recoup those lost behavioral skills. That is how regression and recoupment works. You have a certain skill at the end of the school year, you're going to regress and lose skills that you have, and it's going to take you more than a reasonable period of time to get those skills back. They can be academic or behavior. Now this is important. Following a 5 to 10 day school break, like the winter holidays, a reasonable recoupment period. If your son or daughter is going to lose skills over the holidays, you can request extended school year to cover that period. It may be because it's 2 weeks long. You may want extended school year 2 days a week for those 2 weeks. But following a 5 to 10 day school break, a reasonable recoupment period for a student, if they're going to regress, if they regress and lose skills, when they come back to school after 2 weeks, they should be able to regain those skills within a week. And if they haven't recouped those skills within a week, I think they qualify under regression recoupment. At the end of the summer, following a summer break, if a kid has lost skills during the summer, a reasonable recoupment period is 4 weeks. If your kid has skills at the end of the school year, then loses skills during the summer, school restarts, and it takes them more than a month to regain those skills, they qualify under the regression and recoupment standard. They have regressed clearly, and the recoupment period is unreasonable. It takes more than a month. That's how you look at this. But here's where your role becomes critical. Data collection on kids' skills is critical in regression and recoupment, in a regression recoupment determination. So, data must be collected for a student's current skill levels, academic or behavior, in order for a kid to qualify under regression recoupment. If you want your kid to qualify, you want to be sure that data is collected at the end of the school year on what your kid's behavior or academic skill levels are. And the end of the school year means within the last 2 weeks. It doesn't mean 3 months before the end of school year. You want to know exactly what your kid's skill level is at the end of the school year. So the kid's skills have to be measured in the last 2 weeks of school. And when they come back, in order to determine how much your son or daughter has regressed, they need to collect data at the start of the school year, at the end of the summer. If they wait 6 weeks to collect data on regression, your kid has been recouping some of those skills during that 6-week period that they've never even looked at them. So you want to know exactly what has been the extent of regression for the kid. In order to know that, they have to measure that at the start of the new school year. So what skills did your kid have at the end of the school year? That has to be measured at the end of the school year. How much regression occurred? That needs to be measured at the start of the new school year, not 6 weeks later. And then data must finally be collected on how long did it take to recoup the skills. So my client, your son or daughter, had these 5 skills at the end of the school year. When school restarted, these 5 skills were measured. Your daughter only had, let's say hypothetically, 3 of those skills. They had lost 2 of the skills completely, academic or behavior. But it was measured at the start of the school year, so we knew exactly what was going on. And then we measured how long did it take for them to regain those 2 skills. It took 8 weeks for one of the skills, 6 weeks for the other. The recoupment period was 6 and 8 weeks. It was longer than a month. For a summer break, a reasonable recoupment period is a month. These 2 skills in the example I just gave took 6 and 8 weeks to develop. The recoupment period was too long. So your kid would qualify. There's regression, clearly, 2 skills, and an unreasonable recoupment period for those 2 skills. That is how regression and recoupment is looked at, but you have to have the data on how the kid's doing at the end of the year, at the start of the school year, and when the summer ends, and how much time does it take to recoup. School districts have gotten a lot better about this, a lot better. But there are still instances where they don't have the data. And critical to qualifying under this standard is the data. You have to have the data on skill levels at the end of the school year, what skills were lost during the summer, measured at the beginning of the next school year, and how long did it take to recoup. Next, critical point of instruction. This is the second eligibility criteria. This is where a kid can qualify when ESY services are necessary to enable the student to achieve a critical point of instruction which will prevent 1. Any loss of general education class time, or which will prevent any increase in special education service time due to a lack of academic or social skill development. So, critical point of instruction is it will prevent, ESY will prevent a loss of general education time, or it will prevent an increase in special education time, or it will prevent any loss of significant progress made towards the acquisition or maintenance of a critical self-help. It will prevent any loss of significant progress. Yes, this is similar to regression and recoupment, but it stands on its own. It will prevent any loss of significant progress made toward the acquisition, in this case, of self-help, community access, academic, social, and or behavioral skills. Excessive absences. Most school districts around the country, you can qualify for ESY if you've been absent during the school year for more than 20 to 25 days for health-related reasons. Now, many districts will say if you've been absent more than 20 days, you can't, you cannot pass to the next grade. Well, this is how you can use extended school year services to make up for those absences related to health concerns. You can use extended school year if a kid has 23 absences to make up those absences during the extended school year period. So it's really important. Excessive absences due to health-related conditions related to a kid's disability, you can get extended school year for that purpose. And also because a kid has failed to make meaningful progress on because of excessive absences, a kid has failed to make meaningful progress on his IEP goals and objectives. There are many kids who have excessive absences. I mean, imagine being out of school for 4 or 5 weeks due to health-related issues. You're not going to make as much progress as if you were there those 4 or 5 weeks. So in almost every one of those instances, a kid will not have made as much, I would say as much meaningful progress on her IEP goals and objectives as he or she could have. And oftentimes they will not have made nearly enough. So excessive absences and lack of progress as a result is a reason for extended school year services. And then finally, extenuating circumstances. Most states and school districts offer this as an ESY criteria. A student does not meet the other ESY eligibility criteria, yet still needs ESY services. Here are some examples. The student is in a self-contained classroom placement, but may be able to increase time in general ed classes if provided ESY services. May be able to. That's a reason to argue for ESY. It's not a critical point of instruction where the kid's going to, where we know the kid is going to end up in more special ed time, or is not going to be able to increase his time in general ed. We know that's going to happen. That's a critical point of instruction. Here, it may happen. The kid may end up longer in a self-contained setting without ESY services. That's an extenuating circumstance. We want to try to do what we can to keep kids in inclusive settings as much as possible. And if ESY, extended school year, will help the kid maintain or increase his time in general ed, that can be an extenuating circumstance. Here is a student, or a student can have numerous health-related absences, but not up to the level of 20 or 25 absences by the screening date for ESY. But the IEP team expects that the student will have several more absences between March 15th and the end of the school year, bringing them to the level of 20 to 25. So this is kind of looking ahead saying, the student has had 16 absences. They're not at the threshold of 20 to 25, but it's only March 15th. By the time school's out on May 20th, we fully expect this student will have more than 20 absences. So we are going to, at this point, state that these are extenuating circumstances. the student doesn't qualify under the excessive absences criteria, but we know they're going to be there in 2.5 months. We're going to qualify them instead now because we know they are going to get there. We're going to qualify them today under extenuating circumstances. So keep this in mind for students who are missing a fair amount of school or a considerable amount of school because of health-related issues. Okay, next steps. There are free resources for each training module available for download from PWSA, USA website, and the website is listed there. If you need assistance with school issues, please contact PWSA at the number listed and ask to speak to a family support counselor. If you have questions or comments about this module or the WeSeat in general, please contact Evan Farrar at Evan's email address, which is listed on this slide. And no portion of WeSeat is reproducible, this webinar is reproducible without the written permission of PWSA and or the presenters of each module. This concludes the webinar. Thank you for attending. I hope that you have found this information helpful, and I hope it's of assistance to you in going forward advocating for your sons and daughters or other relatives. And I sincerely wish you the very best in your advocacy on behalf of your sons and daughters and relatives. So thank you again, and please get back to PWSA if you have any comments or concerns about this webinar or any feedback. Thank you.